us in this room who are committed to democracy know in our bones that democracy didn't happen by accident, and it will not continue without deliberate, mindful effort.
Hello and welcome to Stone Cold Discussions. In this first episode, we're going to sit down with Dale Leier, a self-described serial entrepreneur who believes that we need to look beyond government for solutions to the current economic and homeless crisis that we face. He will also recount some of his early childhood memories of the Lethbridge Airport and his passion to see it proceed and progress beyond its current economic state and be a long-term staple of Lethbridge for now and generations to come. And finally, he will discuss some of the philosophy around his run for City Council, why he wanted to do it, and the lessons that he took from it. So without further ado, here is Stone Cold Discussions. Well, hi Dale, thank you for coming here.
Well, thank you for having me, Thomas. This is really exciting, and looking forward to what you have on your agenda.
All right, so there's three basic topics that we want to discuss here. I know that you're passionate about Lethbridge Airport issues, as well as the homeless and economic issues that we're facing in Lethbridge and Alberta and the country as a whole. And then there's the water treatment plant issues. So those are the kind of our three main topics of conversation. So starting with the airport, we in our pre-discussions, you indicated that there was the debate right now is the long-term sustainability of our airport, and larger carriers are hesitant to extend service here because we can't accommodate their Boeing 747s, and we need basically to expand the land there and the facilities. And I know that you are quite passionate about that, so I want to give the floor to you and explain what do you think are the critical issues with that, and what do you think we should propose for long-term solutions. Is there a better feasible long-term solution? Because I know that the Lethbridge City Council extended the airport is under Lethbridge City Council control right now, and they voted that a couple of years ago. We are almost at the end of that 5-year plan that they put in place to keep it under Lethbridge control. So do you think that is the way to go, or what do you think about the issue as a whole at the moment?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and again, thank you for having me. So, to your point about the Lethbridge Airport, it's an interesting piece of infrastructure. It's one that, as you say, I'm very passionate about. It's near and dear to my heart. My earliest memories was going out there on Sundays with my parents when I was like 3 years old, and you didn't have all these layers of security. You could actually walk into the hangars. You could walk up and touch the airplanes and stuff, And at one time, Lethbridge Airport was very critical for our national transportation system because it's on both north-south and east-west routes. It also served as a training facility for the RCAF during the Second World War. Now, what's happened in the meantime is it's gone through various iterations. It's been very pivotal. It's been very pivotal in the evolution of Canada's transportation infrastructure. So Stubb Ross started the Lethbridge Air Service, which eventually became Time Air, which morphed into Canadian Regional and then became part of Jazz, and so the story goes. The point is, at one time we did have really good air services here, but Canada and the world was a different place then. What's happened in the meantime, we've had evolution in our highway traffic systems. We've also had a restructuring of the entire infrastructure. So at one time, Transport Canada ran everything, and then they wisely decided they're not really very good at running airports and so forth. So what they decided to do is get rid of those properties, hand them over to municipalities, and let them set up regional airport authorities to run with them. Now, Lethbridge, the city of Lethbridge, was on tap when Transport Canada made this decision, and they were going to let the city take it over. And some people I know on council at the time were actually part of that negotiation. Then, while they were getting close to signing the documents, somebody realized that they had an obligation to first offer it to the jurisdiction in which the airport was located, which in this case was the county of Lethbridge.
Right.
And the county of Lethbridge, being no dummies, said, "Oh, huge piece of industrial infrastructure. We'll take it and we'll add it to our tax base, and life will be good." No surprise, they didn't know a lot about running an airport. And so the cost of running an airport exceeded the revenues. So the city of Lethbridge had to step in and subsidize it. Because like so many public infrastructure projects, it's not the capital expense that hurts you, it's the long-term operating cost. And what nobody still seems to have figured out, airports are a business.
Yes.
And so if you don't have an effective marketing strategy, if you don't have experienced management and oversight, you're probably bound to fail, or you're going to bleed a lot of cash. So we are at sort of a critical turning point where we have to start putting this asset to work. There are improvements which need to be made. There is a shortage of funding for all kinds of infrastructure around Southern Alberta. Right. So I think the proper solution is to take the facility out of the hands of the city of Lethbridge and create a regional airport authority. The Southern Alberta Regional Airport Authority, which would encompass all the communities of Southern Alberta and allow them to have a say in this asset and in effect take a bit of ownership in it, because when people have a say in things, they tend to be more of a buy-in and there's more engagement. We have a lot of opportunity. We could be running Dash 8s, I figure 2 a day to Vancouver alone. We could probably be running an RJ per day to Toronto. So there's a lot of opportunity here. There's just not a lot of leadership in it. Airlines do what airlines do. They try and optimize their revenue, and they take the measures that are in their own best interest. But we are in a bit of a competition between Calgary and Great Falls. So we have to put ourselves on a competitive footing. And that's where I think the city, unfortunately, doesn't realize it's not really quite the same as running a bus service. It's much more involved, it's much more integrated, it's much more technical, and it's much more competitive. So that's the opportunity and the challenge that we face.
Right. It's at the end of the day, it always comes down to economics. And from what you're saying, do you think that there is a way to make a long-term profitable airport system? Because I know that as you said, one of the improvements needs to be made is we can't accommodate the big Boeing planes right now from the large carriers, and so they're debating, like they're reluctant to extend service to the city because we lack the proper infrastructure, and so there's obviously an investment that needs to be made there, and it's like it seems as though the question becomes, we put in an investment, how do we make sure that, one, it does not go to waste, and that we can actually, we put in an investment, and obviously we want to get the revenue out of it. Do you think that there is a way to go about that will be profitable?
Well, quite so, and that's why I propose a regional airport authority, so some that would take over the legal and financial obligation of running the facility, but it would also give them the borrowing capacity.
Right.
So it's the same reason why Transport Canada got out of the air traffic business, because they found out that governments aren't really very good at providing that level of and type of service. So it's much the same with the airport. The city can't really start borrowing and funding an airport that they aren't really well experienced at running. So that's why putting it into the hands of a regional airport authority with professional management and giving them their own, again, borrowing capacity, authority to develop the property. There hasn't been a new hangar built there in like 20 years. Meanwhile, in all your surrounding communities, Tabor, Pincher Creek, Vulcan, Fort McLeod, all these, they've seen Tabor. They've seen lots of hangars built in the last 20 years.
Yes.
Excuse me.
So that
edit that one out.
I had to cut around that. So right, and that I think is ultimately seems to be the question from whatever I've read of other news articles and input from the community.
It seems as though, like, is Lethbridge in a position to be a profitable destination as a whole? That to me seems to be almost a larger question. Because, I mean, what are we doing to attract tourism as a whole in this city, right?
Very good question. So obviously, City of Lethbridge has invested a lot of money in promoting Lethbridge as a destination, but also you are seeing investments in infrastructure. So the Agri-Food Hub, which is designed to host conferences and conventions and so forth, great idea. Just a couple of problems. Number one, where are you going to put the conventioneers? We don't have enough hotel rooms. And second of all, once we get the hotel rooms, how are you going to get them here? Right. Bring them from Calgary on a bus? You know, it's be really counterproductive and stuff. So again, the amount of investment that we would need to be able to accommodate jet aircraft isn't that large. It does mean making some commitments, adding a second floor holding area for passengers with an air bridge. We're only talking a few $1 million here, but then that would allow you to accommodate jets in all weather. So I know there was some talk about having an airline come in here and service the Arizona market, but nobody figured out what do you do with the passengers, because it's not just the passengers that are on the airplane, it's the ones that are getting off. They have to exchange baggage and everything like that. And so the airport is undersized. The terminal is actually undersized for the community.
Yeah, so I've been there a few times myself. It's a rather crunch space.
Yeah, so there's so it's got some limitations there, but there's other things we can do with the airport. For example, Pratt & Whitney, which has been here for decades, they have built over 20,000 gas turbine engines, which are used in business corporate aircraft, commuter aircraft, all over the world. But not a single one of those engines has gone into an airframe here, and none of them are being used for maintenance, repair, and overhaul services. There's also been some talk about attracting an air freight carrier here. There's the manufacturing, aviation manufacturing. I happen to know of some people that do have an interest in manufacturing aircraft, and Lethbridge would present an option. But there has been so many of these opportunities over the year that we have just continued to almost like avoid. And that's because, again, we don't really have that business mindset.
Right, and you said before that we're lacking leaderships. Could you comment a little more on that itself?
I'm sorry, what was that?
You said before that the city was lacking leadership on the issue.
Well, it's not an area of specialty, right? So you really need to have the competence, the experience, community support, certainly a very important part of it, but it also means having the vision, right? And being able to get people to buy into it. So that's where the leadership component is. And it's not just the airport. That sense of approach is what's really missing in so many of the problems that we have.
Do you think that things were handled better under the previous administration, or do you think that the current administration is better set to solve these issues long term?
Well, we're moving the ball down the field. Let's just put it that way. Again, we've gone from having it under the county, in which case the facility didn't go anywhere. In fact, when I'm retired from air traffic control and I moved back to Lethbridge, I was shocked to find out that they were on the verge of plowing the whole thing under. And I thought that was strategically a very, very, very poor move. Mm-hmm. So the city of Lethbridge took it over and put the money into it and got some grants and helped it move forward. Now it's time to move it to the next step, to again put it under professional administration as a regional facility. I mean, we have the Chinook Regional Hospital, so why not the Chinook Regional Airport? So it's something I think that we could get buy-in from people across southern Alberta. It's not that convenient driving to Great Falls or Calgary to catch a flight. It's just the fallback position that many people have. So there's a huge opportunity. Again, we know from traffic data, there's more than enough people from southern Alberta flying to major centers from here.
And I know that we were also looking at trying to attract cross-border traffic as well because of our position.
It's huge. It's a huge opportunity, So, I mean, right off the bat, direct flight to Salt Lake City is a no-brainer.
Right.
From there, you can connect to practically anywhere in the world, and more. But all you need to do is some comparisons. Now, we do have a problem with the way the Canadian air traffic system is structured, but you take a look at places like Bozeman, Billings, Kalispell, Great Falls, I mean, they got direct flights to Chicago, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, again, Salt Lake all day long, Seattle. And they're like nowhere near as big as we are. They don't even have the market size that we are. You know, the argument has been, well, you know, we're so close to Great Falls and Calgary, you can't, you know, have an airport here that has jet traffic. Well, I would just like to use Vancouver Island as an example. So you got jet traffic in and out of Victoria. You know, an hour away you've got Nanaimo. You know, a little bit past that you've got Comox. And they've got jet traffic in and out of those airports, and they're in close proximity to each other all day long. Nanaimo has direct flights to Toronto. You know, so it's an opportunity there. It just requires commitment, it requires vision, it requires leadership, and it requires, frankly, salesmanship.
So that. Thank you for your comments on that. So shifting gears into now probably one of the biggest issues that we are facing in the city and in the country, a homeless economic crisis. Because we have the homeless issue, and we've got an economic crisis where the average person now is struggling to pay their bills, which wasn't the issue like 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I know that there's many facets to this. There's the homeless, stereotypically, you know, they have the drug problem that needs to be solved. We have a housing supply that's lacking right now. The federal government is implementing strategies and plans to build more housing, and they're currently in the process of that. But the difficulty with that comes with you can build houses, but if nobody can afford to live in them, then it's pointless. So how do you see this issue playing out in Lethbridge? I know we're facing a huge problem. The downtown of the city right now is struggling to attract people to the business. We've got a high vagrancy. The police feel like they're handicapped in the whole thing because they can't solve it. So what do you think, how do we approach this, you know, to start off with, what do you think we need to focus on? What do you think are the major issues at play, and what are some solutions?
Well, that, of course, is the question for our ages, isn't it?
Yes.
Let me just start off by saying Lethbridge is not the only one to have these problems. They're everywhere. And just in some places, they're even much worse. I just came back from Vancouver, and over the years, I've just watched it steadily decline to the point where lower side of Vancouver, Lower East Side, is a disaster.
Skid
I
Row,
mean, you've got, well, I don't even know if it's Skid Row. I mean, at one time it used to be really a high-end district, and that was the only East Hastings. But now you've got block after block after block of buildings that are boarded up. You've got encampments on the street. Mm-hmm. You've got, I mean, obviously, the open drug use, but you've got hundreds of people lying on a sidewalk, and it's impossible to tell if they're asleep or dead. Like, it's just an absolute economic disaster. Here's the ironic thing about it. Vancouver is some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And they can literally take and put every single one of those people into an apartment and give them food and clothing and everything that they need, and still have money left over from the increase in economic value from all that property. So again, by not dealing with the problem effectively, they have wiped billions of dollars of equity off the assets of that structure. Now, could that happen in Lethbridge? To a greater or lesser degree, I suppose. But you know, the thing is there's no silver bullet here.
Right.
We're looking at the interplay of a number of factors. Certainly, social change is an issue. We have demographic issues. We have cultural issues. Certainly, addiction is an issue. But I also believe you did say something that's really critical. It's fundamentally an economic issue.
Right.
So the way to approach those challenges, of course, is to encourage investment. But from the broader point of view, we could certainly do lots to bring down the cost of housing. For example, opening up more land for economic development. I know we have large parcels of land in Lethbridge that are effectively barriered from development for no fundamentally good reason. We have the city of Lethbridge itself, which is a very active player in the land development business, which kind of puts it into a conflict of interest, because on the one hand, they're the legislature and the regulator, but then they're also an operator. So that makes it difficult when you're a private property owner and you want to be a developer, you're basically in competition with the city. So philosophically, the city of Lethbridge, or actually any government for that matter, probably shouldn't be an operator of anything that can be performed effectively by the private sector. I mean, there's some things like fire and police and so forth, which, you know, you probably want to leave in the hands of government, military and so forth. But when it comes to actual operational things like construction, development and stuff like that, the private sector can probably do it better. As a matter of fact, I would challenge anyone to point out to a single thing government can do more economically than the private sector. I can't actually think of anything. So there's really no reason for government to be involved in a lot of these things, but they see it as a revenue generating opportunity. They try to act like a business. What they really should do is focus on acting business-like, which is not the same thing. They're not there to be making a profit. So that's and that's a whole other discussion.
So you're of the notion that the private sector is a better candidate to solve these long-term issues than government is. The difficulty I would see with that is private sector obviously is strictly for profit, and if we're trying to create profit at every turn, I would see that almost as a downside, because it's like once you get everything private, now the incentive for profit becomes that much bigger. So it's like, how would you see a for-profit model solving the current issues?
Well, again, you have to take a little step back and just take a look at it from the point of view of economic growth. Okay, so as I famously said to one of my economics professors at the university, nothing cures poverty like money. And so if you want to create jobs, if you want people to have their financial independence, if you want them to have the sense of pride and accomplishment and well-being, nothing beats having a job. Right. And that's, again, when you harken back to the days of old, when you had the nuclear family and you had one wage earner. Right. Again, it's because they could actually make a decent living at one job. Now, of course, there's a lot more that goes into it. It's not just the income side, it's also the expense side. Right. And by not having the private sector involved in any of these things, we've increased the cost side to the point where one family income ain't going to do it anymore. Right. So it's a combination of things. Again, investments in education, investments in social services. I actually do see a role for society. I'm not antisocial. It's just about, where is the best use of those funds? And again, does government have to do it all, or can they not effectively contract it out? And so that's what I mean when I talk about the private sector as well. Sometimes, we can kind of maybe misallocate funds. So, for example, I know there's a lot of discussion about revitalizing downtown Lethbridge. Right. Well, what does that mean exactly? Right. What does revitalization look like? How do you know when you've achieved it? Right. And I really believe in any of these endeavors, it's really important to have targets. Now, governments hate having numbers because, again, you need transparency to have accountability. Well, the first thing that you need to have is numbers. For example, I've asked the city of Lethbridge, how many people have died on Lethbridge streets due to unnatural causes in the past year? Oh, well, we don't have those numbers. Well, have you ever bothered asking like the coroner's office? But it's kind of like, well, nothing to see here, folks, move along, right? So that's half the situation right now. It's just collecting data, but it also starts with what's your goal. Then that's where the visioning and leadership things come in. Let's start off with, what do we want Lethbridge to look at? What do we want it to be? How do we see ourselves in the future? What do we want to accomplish? And then you work backwards from that and saying, okay, these are the obstacles, these are the challenges. What are the possible and proposed solutions? So I really believe there is a role for healthcare, education, social services, and a number of things like to attract the problems. It's a complicated issue. Right. Everything is all intertwined and everything else. Right. But let's establish some goals. But let's first start with a little bit of transparency and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that's where a lot of the argument is. People think that all levels of government are not being fully accountable, and that's a frustration. As far as what you were saying about downtown Vancouver East Side, I've been there a few times myself, and I've seen the tent cities, and I've seen many documentaries on that.
Yeah.
They even have a special phone now on one of the streets to call overdose team when there's an overdose. Like they have a special phone just for that now. And it's like we didn't used to have that. So yeah, we are seeing these tent cities pop up virtually everywhere, and I see that the government is building more housing, and it's like as I think we discussed before, the economic situation of itself, I think, is probably one of the biggest issues at play with this, because obviously people need money in order to pay for a house, and right now, as you said, back in the 50s, one income could provide for a life easily. Now we don't live in that climate anymore. We've got two parents working, which is causing a lot more stress. Right now, like I've seen the latest headlines around the economy. Right now, we're in historic levels of debt. The average household income has stagnated, and we're increasingly taking on these bigger and bigger debt loads to service these economic issues. So I see that resulting in a long-term crisis beyond what we've got right now, because I think we can help the average homeowner to a certain extent who isn't, having drug issues or whatever. But for those who are, the conversation always seems to be, well, we obviously need to help them and give them a home, but then they can't sustain the home. So I think that if we're trying to solve the long-term issues, like right now, there's a fight over the minimum wage, trying to keep it lower. Like the corporate world wants to keep that lower. People are demanding it go higher because they can't pay their bills. So you've got that tension. There's not as many. There's the education component as well. Higher educated people can obviously afford something better. So, do you think that there needs to be from what you're saying, there needs to be a multi-pronged approach to solving this long term?
Absolutely. It's a complex problem, and there's no single solution. We need to attack it from a number of different sides. Just speaking to that whole issue of affordability, though. So here's a thought that sometimes people forget about demanding higher wages. They rightfully make the argument, look, we can't make a living on minimum wage.
Right.
Well, why is that? Well, because, for one thing, inflation. Why do we have inflation? Why do we have rising prices? Well, because we have rising costs. Well, what's the main part of those costs? Energy is a big part of it. The other big part of it's labor. So you see, it sort of becomes a self-feeding problem. The higher the wages, the more the inflation, the higher the wages that you need. Now, one of the other things that's happened is we have been conditioned, trained, educated to look to government to solve all these problems. Well, there isn't enough government in the world to solve all of our economic problems, just like there's not enough police in the world to keep everybody honest. So we really need a change in culture. We need to start developing a sense of, again, not just government accountability, but personal accountability and self-reliance. And we need to start working on developing solutions where we are the leaders. When you think about it, a real change doesn't actually come from the government. They're actually followers. And the best example is probably the environmental movement. That did not come from government.
Right.
Government responded to public demand.
Yes.
So again, one of the things that we need to do is, I think, start refocusing on the things that we can do as individuals to help. But going back to the thing again about corporate profits and so forth, remember, if a company doesn't make a profit, it's out of business. But that is actually what makes corporations a much more effective vehicle for growing your economy, because that's the metric that they have, and that's the metric that's missing in government. Again, when they don't have enough money, they have some easy solutions. We'll borrow more, we'll drive up the debt, or we'll raise taxes. That's their two primary mechanisms. Now, I would also say as well, in those services and goods that governments do provide, they do have the ability to raise those prices as well. But if you look at a side-by-side comparison between government provided goods and services and private sector provided goods and services, again, the government has no incentive to cut costs. They have an incentive to increase revenue. But in fact, historically, government goods and services, the prices have risen far above the rate of inflation.
Right.
right? So that's the difference. A corporation actually has a metric for success. It's called a profit.
Right.
And I think profit's kind of gotten a bit of a bad name because everybody sees businesses and business people as all those greedy profiteers.
Right.
It's, you know, it's just a mechanism. Capitalism is just a mechanism for allocating scarce resources, right? Otherwise, you know, and then I would say, you know, if you want to get a little philosophical here, the difference between capitalism and socialism, socialists believe that the economic pie is only certain size, and that it's their mission to make sure everybody gets an equal piece. Capitalists say, how big of a piece of pie do you want? We'll make it as big as it needs to be. So that's the difference. Capitalism is very outward looking, it's very visionary, it's very creative, it's very responsive to the economic environment. Socialism is very much about control, the lowest common denominator, and again, their fairness is important, but it can also be an obsession.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads me into where I want to go next is, you know, it's like I can hear the screams of millennials going, oh, this is just a typical conversation, right? The millennials seem to be the ones that feel like they are, you know, on the crap end of the stick. And granted, I would say they don't have the same economic power that their parents did, and the landscape has changed significantly. But speaking of millennials specifically, what do you think the long-term solutions are to help, you know, the millennials who haven't had the same chances and don't have the same incomes? I mean, we've heard of student millennials that are living in, you know, rundown apartments that practically aren't even inhabitable.
Yeah.
Right? So that's obviously an issue. And then there's, you know, and that kind of goes into the landlords right now, and there's a huge anti-landlord, anti-profit sentiment out there right now, because, you know, everybody is, especially the millennials and Gen Z are going, I can't pay your staggering prices. But the landlord is going, well, I have my own costs too, and I have to profit from this. So how do you see that reconciling itself?
Well, first of all, I empathize. I mean, it's tough. It has always been tough,
right?
You know, so I would say that's kind of the first thing to realize is that life ain't easy, folks, and it really is incumbent on each of us at the end of the day to grab the bull by the horns and do what we can to take control and responsibility for our own situation. Now, it is a bit of an uphill climb. I certainly get that. One of the reasons why everybody feels burdened is because we have the weight of government to carry. I mean, remember, it comes in first. It takes the money off the top. You take a look at your GST, or in some provinces, your HST and PST. You look at your other forms of taxes, your carbon taxes and your other consumption tax and everything like that. The government takes that first. So we're left to use what's left over. So going back to the concerns about private enterprise, corporations, profit and stuff like that, I think part of the problem is a little bit of a lack of understanding. And I think, sadly, unfortunately, it's a little bit of, I put that on our education system, where people don't really quite understand how the economy actually works. Right. And I think that's important to understand. The reason being is once you do that, now you can have a basis for comparison and understanding, is your government actually serving you, or are you serving your government? And that's where I think we can make some improvements. But none of this is going to get changed overnight.
Right.
I'm very much in favor of change, but not change it so rapid that it upsets the old apple cart and now nobody knows what's happening anymore. But we do have, again, goes back to that transparency and accountability, right, combined with the lack of leadership and vision, which basically has us going around in circles, pointing the fingers at each other, blaming each other, not doing a lot to fix the problem. But I would just say, again, going back to the housing situation in Lethbridge, it's been well documented that the biggest problem is government red tape, and that certainly applies in the situation of Lethbridge. We live in the least densely populated country on earth. We also have the highest number of natural resources per capita of any country on earth. We should be the richest people on earth. We should not have homelessness problems. We should not have employment problems. We should not have debt and deficit problems. But what's happened over the years is we've focused on the extraction of resources. We haven't concentrated on our IP industries. We haven't concentrated on developing downstream activities. We've always just focused on raw material extraction and primary processing. And if you want to be a player in the world, you've got to go into the secondary and tertiary industries, and you've got to be a great trading nation. Canada is almost a victim of its wealth, and it's really undermined our motivation to come up with solutions. So there is no reason for any of these things, and we just need to make different plans.
You know, I've heard criticism over the social safety net and whether it needs to be updated to suit modern standards. But then there's the question of, you know, are we relying on that too much? Should we empower people economically through other ways? As you said, education. Should we be subsidizing education, make it easier? Like, as you said, we have I would say a historic issue, and there should not be in a country with the resources that we have, this should not be happening, but yet it is. And it seems as though every time we get talking about the homeless issue, and then everybody, like, stereotypically, everybody just goes to, oh, well, the drugs. And it's like, okay, obviously when it comes to that population, some intervention has to be done at some point in order to make them more productive citizens of society. But then again, the question is, right, you can't force anyone into recovery. So how do you think we can go about trying to solve specifically the drug issue as well as the homeless within that population?
Well, it's an investment, you know, and again, of the two things that I think government should be most involved in is education, right? Of all the things that governments can do globally, the highest return on investment is education, right? That's number one. When it comes to things like healthcare, again, we like to believe that we've got the greatest healthcare system in the world. We don't. And all you have to do is look at the fact that we spend more per capita on healthcare than almost any other country, and yet we've got almost also some of the longest wait times. Why is that, right? It's because, again, we carry a very high overhead. Again, it's easy to criticize,
right,
but I think it's important to have an alternative. And
right,
one of the things that we have is inertia. We also have a lot of people who are highly invested in the status quo, particularly in those particular institutions where there's a lot of resistance to change. So change is going to come by slowly. It's really funny, people fear a so-called two-tier healthcare system.
right.
I've got news. We have a multi-tier healthcare system already. Wealthy people can go anywhere in the world for healthcare, right? And in fact, the more that do, the more resources that are left over to help those that can't. So we've also got, for example, different types of healthcare. For example, eye care, dental care, ear care. We've got different types of healthcare for different populations and different needs and situations, stuff like that. So I really think we need to open up our minds to a broader level of services. Again, the more people that utilize private healthcare services, the more resources are left over for those who don't have the resources. So again, I think, was it Einstein that said the type of thinking that we used for the problems that we have is not the type of thinking that's going to allow us to change. We need to change our minds, we need to change our views, and we need to change our approaches if we're going to affect change.
Right, and that's one of the things I think you mentioned before, is that I think there's too much of a pressure to maintain status quo instead of thinking outside the box and outside the box ideas and suggestions. So speaking specifically of Lethbridge and downtown, that's been one of the biggest areas of conversation in the last few years with the growing homeless issue, the drugs. Bell Gardens, especially, and the businesses around that are really trying to sound the alarm that there's a growing economic issue, a growing drug issue. It's affecting businesses, it's affecting people when they come down there. Even a couple months ago, there was a big conversation around the proposal to put up an iron fence around Galt Gardens, thinking that that might solve the issue. You know, a lot of people thought that that was just absolutely craziness. But these are the kind of things that are being tossed out to try to, from my view, put a Band-Aid on the issue rather than trying to come up with a long-term solution. So speaking of specifically Lethbridge and downtown and the business, culture, and climate, what do you think we could try to do to try to tackle specifically downtown Lethbridge and the economic issues from businesses and the drug issue?
Mea culpa, it was my idea to put the fence in. Because I thought it was a pretty legitimate idea. I mean, what business do people have in that park at night? What I didn't realize is that people would feel intimidated to using the park during the day. So it's like everything. You can have the greatest ideas in the world, but nobody can appreciate everything, and it's that law of unintended consequences. So my thoughts were, you know what, we need to make it a safe place in order to make it an appealing place. I really think, speaking of Galt Gardens, my vision is actually for something akin to the Mootart Gardens in downtown Edmonton, where they've taken a beautiful piece of river valley and they've built this incredible system of pyramids that are open year-round. They have a mix of tropical and temperate and desert environments and stuff. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's attraction. Anybody that's lived in Lethbridge a long time remembers the old brewery gardens, which where the Lethbridge Brewery was, and we had the beautiful flower garden and stuff like that. And it was a tourist attraction, and we've lost that. So again, creating some features and attractions for people who want to go to Galt Gardens year-round would certainly be, I think, a worthwhile investment. Somebody had the bright idea that building a water park would make a difference. Well, first of all, it's seasonal.
Yeah.
Second of all, you still need to secure the area. And third, who's the market that you're trying to serve? Because yes, there are a lot of residences that are close to downtowns, but they're mostly seniors residences. There aren't a lot of families living downtown. And the notion that people are going to drop their kids off at the water park while they go shopping. See, the world has changed. And again, City Council hasn't really caught up to that. Retail shopping is dying everywhere. You know, big box stores, they're going broke, you know. So we need to adjust to the future instead of trying to recreate the past. And in fact, that's what I think revitalization is trying to do, is recreate the past, you know, water that's gone over the falls. Time to start looking ahead. I really believe that encouraging housing development in the downtown area would make it vital again. See, we have a sort of a structural problem with downtown. We have a lot of institutions down there, and they have basically not really consumer-friendly street sides, right? So you've got, you know, you've got campuses, you've got financial institutions, you've got training facilities, stuff like that. At night, they're locked up, and what you do is you have a cold, dark street. That's not inviting to anybody, you know. So it needs an approach. Like anything, you throw money at something, but if people aren't prepared to put their own money into it, you're probably chasing your tail, and you probably won't get the returns that you want. Again, cutting taxes, property taxes would be really good. Cutting red tape would be another one, you know, to encourage investment.
Red tape, yes, that's I was actually going to ask you about that earlier. Red tape, that I keep on hearing these days, you know, government and red tape, and it's blocking the private sector from being able to contribute any solutions to these issues because they just feel like they're buried under that red tape. Do you believe that there is, I guess, you know, a better question is so if there is that red tape, how do we go about trying to either reduce that, get rid of it? Is it lobbying? Is it like, what do we need to do to try to get around these sticking points?
Well, there have been a lot of efforts to remove red tape. Both the province of BC and Alberta have had specific red tape reduction initiatives. Recently, I reached out to City of Lethbridge and said, who's in charge of reducing red tape? Mm-hmm. I got no response from administration, and similarly I've talked to our elected officials, and the mayor denies that there is a red tape issue. So it's hard to solve a problem when you guys have Problem? Who? Us? No. No. The reality of it is it takes again another mindset. It takes a belief that government isn't the answer for everything. Again, government should focus on legislation, regulation, and enforcement. It doesn't need to be an operator, but there really needs to be a focus on helping people cut through the red tape. So, case in point, City of Calgary has a concierge service, whereby if you want to set up a business in Calgary, you have a single point of contact and somebody who understands the system, the laws, regulations, bylaws, and resources, who can walk a business person through the process quickly. Because what municipal officials forget, capital is mobile. Nobody has to invest in Lethbridge. See, it's very difficult for governments to make things happen, but they can, in fact, stymie investment and prevent things from happening. So there needs to be a mindset. So when you go and approach a city official here and you want to do something, the attitude is, well, why should we? Well, the attitude should be, why not? Right? And so we need a change in mindset. And to me, that's where the vision and leadership comes from.
Change in mindset, yes, I would agree. I think that is one of the biggest hurdles to solving any of this is, again, I think we're stuck in status quo, and when nobody wants to think outside of the box and go, okay, well, we've already tried these over and over and over, and they're not producing the long-term results we're looking for. But it's like, as you say, where's the leadership to say, okay, this hasn't worked before. We need to figure out different ideas for a different economy, because this economy is different than the one 60 years ago or whatever it is. So I would agree with you. I think that those long-term, I guess, profitability and sustainability is really where the crux of the conversation is. Shifting gears to, I know a topic that you're passionate about is the water treatment plant here in the city, and you had said in the pre-interview that you think that the province needs to come in more to solve that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the status of our wastewater treatment plant is sort of a symptom of the other problems that we face here at the municipal level. Again, there isn't any incentive to look ahead. Now, again, we've had previous administrations that have been very much obsessed on investing in things that are of high public profile. Water and wastewater aren't very sexy until the tap doesn't turn on and the toilet overflows.
Right.
Then it gets sexy really fast.
Exactly.
So the problem is that they haven't been high-profile issues. So what's happened is every successive administration has kicked the ball further and further down the road. So now we are at an intersection of the past and the future, where on the one hand we've got billions of dollars of investment capital that wants to come to Southern Alberta. The province of Alberta has said we want this to be the next Idaho, because again, they're doing what they can to try and attract investment. They're investing in infrastructure like irrigation systems, highways, railways, convention facilities, and so forth. So they're investing and doing what they can. But it's an incumbent upon the municipalities to make the right kind of decisions, which will help stimulate further trade and investment. So it's not just Lethbridge. We have a situation in Canada right now where we have a lot of net immigration, which is great. But what we haven't done is a very good a job of planning for that. Right. So things like housing, things like education, things like support services, and helping to accommodate new arrivals. And so, you know, again, the presumption by the federal government is people are just going to go and migrate to the major centers where it's easier to accommodate new arrivals. Which is reasonable to the extent that people tend to go and move where their families are. The problem is that affordability issue, as you mentioned. Right. So again, smaller, like second-tier cities, towns, and villages, that's where our opportunity lies. That's where the growth opportunity lies. That's where the potential for jobs, employment, affordable housing, and actually less crime exists in these smaller locations. That's really where the focus needs to be. We have that opportunity here. But again, Lethbridge isn't the only community in Southern Alberta, or in Alberta, right, that has dropped the ball on water and wastewater. Canmore has hit the same limit now, and there's 2 new subdivisions that have been approved for Canmore. And you've got the same situation. They can't grow because, again, now they need to make investments in water and wastewater. Now, the province, for its part, everybody just says, well, can't they just write a check? Well, yeah, but that means that something else they're not going to be spending money on, like healthcare and education. Right? A dollar can only be spent once.
Right.
So at the end of the day, it's still incumbent on the municipalities to show leadership in these areas. They should have been planning for this for years, and they shouldn't have let it get to the point where it's a crisis. So, for example, Culhers, they would like to add more residential lots and stuff, but they can't because the city of Lethbridge can't process their wastewater. Here's the problem. Well, we're aware of the problem. The situation is such that it won't solve itself overnight.
Right.
So this is where the private sector has the wherewithal to step in and provide funding needed to overhaul these infrastructure things. There's a lot of resistance to that, particularly amongst the administration class. But at the end of the day, there's only one taxpayer, shareholder, stakeholder in the entire country, and that's the ordinary person walking around. That's what funds everything. Right. At the end of the day, it all comes down to one person, you and me. But the problem is how do you reduce the overhead? And so anyway, whether it's the government that borrows the money to build water and wastewater facilities, or it's the government that allows the private sector to come in and develop it at a much lower cost and recover that cost from consumers, it still comes down to the same thing. There's only one person to pay for everything, and that's you and me.
And tax dollars, and as you said, a dollar can only be spent once, and all we can do to increase that revenue is hike taxes, which nobody wants.
Right.
So you have that conundrum and that catch-22.
The other way they can do it is just by borrowing money, and that has always been the go-to for governments. We need to change that mindset as well. We need to focus on spending on the most critical and essential areas first, and that's where the opportunity lies to get more mileage out of our money.
Right. I guess that's what I was going to ask you. Do we need to do more to attract outside private sector investment into that as a long-term solution? And what are we doing to do that currently?
Well, actually, it's not a problem at all. I'm aware of international bankers and stuff like that are absolutely clamoring to invest in infrastructure in Canada. See, things like pension funds and insurance funds and so forth, they love infrastructure projects because they're long-term, they're stable, and they're necessities. One thing we always do first is pay for things like our heat, our lights, our water, right? Those are necessities. Those bills always get paid first. Right. It's, and then you've got your food, transportation, everything like that. The things that basically rise and fall based on your fluctuating economic situation are your luxury items. Dining out, right? Furniture, clothes, travel. Those are the things that thrive when the economy is good. Those are the things that suffer when the economy is in decline. Now, from my own experience of being in the food services business, I'm very proud to create jobs that are entry-level positions for people often that are just in high school, just out of high school, maybe aren't even going to high school, don't have skills, and it's an opportunity for them to learn how to be valuable, because the marketplace will tell you what you're worth. So it's none of this stuff's easy, and again, change comes slowly. There is resistance to change, but change we must, because the world is changing.
And would that be part of your motivation for running for city council? I know you didn't really want to make that a focus, but I mean, you were a candidate, and that does hold a certain respect. And obviously, you wanted to do that because you wanted to make change. And as your motto says, we should make this world a better place than we found it. So was that kind of your motivation running for council?
Yeah, it seemed interesting. It wasn't something I was looking for, but I was approached by some people who were running for council and said, "Hey Dale, it'd be great to have you on our team." And then I talked to friends and family member and associates, and he says, "Yeah, Dale, go for it." So I did. Everything's a learning experience,
Right.
There are no bad experiences if you take and try and learn something from it and move forward. What I learned is I'm a lousy politician, right? So I'm fairly opinionated and stuff, and But you know what? I don't really sit anywhere on the political spectrum. I can be to the right, I can be to the left. It just depends on the specific issue, right? So I suppose I'm right of center. But at the end of the day, people on the left can be right about some things. They can also be very wrong.
Right.
People on the right can be right about some things, and they can be very wrong. I try to look at the context and look at the situation and say what makes sense for this situation. But again, I have a bias towards less government.
Yeah, I've heard the less government argument, and I think I would agree with that as far as government has had a habit in recent years and even decades of unfortunately getting in the way of long-term solutions, and it seems as though the House of Commons seems to do more arguing than actually passing bills and actually getting things done. So I think you make a point as far as the governments haven't had a good track record of coming up with these long-term things, and the private sector has. Now, the argument from the latest generation is if you keep everything for profit, now you have a long-term sustainability issue because people can't pay these prices. And landlords are saying, well, we have our costs and we have to profit too, but yet we have people that can't afford, the rising cost of rents. And there's been some discussion of rent control federally. It's getting a huge pushback, obviously, from the current landlords of this country. And I understand the reasons. They do have their costs, obviously. But is there something do you think there's something that has to happen in this equation where we're running into affordability issues, running into income stagnation,
Right.
and building more supply isn't necessarily the solution to that?
Well, I would argue that it is a supply and demand issue. Now, with the subject of rent controls, one of the reasons there is pushback against that is not just from the incumbent landowners, but if you want to attract investment, having rent controls in place actually discourages people from investing in housing. We also have some regulatory issues. For example, I know people that are landlords that can't get rid of their bad tenants. So, there are some regulatory issues. The other thing is if the private sector doesn't do it, do you really want the government to do it? I refer you back to my previous comment that name one thing government can do more efficiently than the private sector. So again, what government can do, I think, is again, be a more effective regulator. They don't need to be the operator. They can certainly do things again by reducing red tape, reduces the cost of developing housing, and then that should lead to increased supply. Again, all these things all relate, but once again, what we're all doing is carrying the burden of government.
Right.
And if government was the solution to everything, well, then why don't they take over everything? Why don't we go to a purely Soviet system or a Chinese system where the government owns all the factors of production? Why don't we let them take over the grocery stores? Why don't we let them take over the gas stations? Well, actually, that was attempted too. It's called Petro-Canada. But you know what I'm getting at is, again, at the end of the day, government ownership is no assurance that you're going to lower your costs. In fact, the opposite is true. Because again, you don't have a metric for performance. How do you measure effectiveness in a private sector? It's do you make a profit or don't you? In a government sector, you need to have layer upon layer upon layer of oversight, and that's a costly overhead. So again, jobs are better. The key to more jobs is education. And so that's kind of we aren't going to change this overnight. But again, it all starts with a vision. What do we want Canada to be? What do we want Alberta to be? What do we want Lethbridge to be? What is our vision for the future? What does that look like? And how do we measure it? And then how do we put measures in place to achieve that? And I don't hear anybody offering that.
I think that this city has been struggling with that for over 10 years now, especially since because the city had a huge population surge in 2013 when the floods hit Calgary. Everybody came down south, and that completely changed the city's landscape. To top it off here, you describe yourself as a serial entrepreneur and helping people with their money issues while having a positive attitude. Could you explain to our viewers a little more of kind of what that's all about?
Okay, well, again, if you want to grow the economy, the best way to do it is to stimulate investment, and the best way to attract investment is to encourage profits. So, in many cases, a lot of people are in business out of necessity. They're what I call accidental entrepreneurs. They might be somebody that's inherited a business. It might be somebody that had a particularly effective home business, a hobby, a crafts business or something like that, and now it's grown beyond what they can manage themselves. So I like to help people. I get personally thrills, reward, and pleasure out of seeing other people succeed. So anything that I can do to share my experience, insight, guidance, problem solving, right? A lot of times it's just about asking questions and allowing people to solve their own problem just by being an outside party that's looking in and saying, well, have you thought of this? Have you thought about, have you tried that? Because I've got a stupid amount of experience. You know, I've probably been involved in at least 100 different types of businesses, either as an employee, as an entrepreneur, as a consultant, as a customer. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so I've got a lot of experience, I've got some insights, I love to share them, especially if it helps somebody else succeed. Because when one person succeeds, we all succeed. And that's why, quite frankly, I'm really excited about prospects for minorities, for Indigenous entrepreneurship, for immigrant entrepreneurship. Those are the kinds of things that make us all stronger. And when we're stronger, we're better together.
Right, and so do you think that, I guess to end it, do you think that better education around, finances and money management is part of the long-term solution of helping people have, long-term financial success? Do you think the education is like, because you keep on going back to sort of that education piece, do you think that is, one of the biggest parts of that pie, so to speak?
Well, it's a huge part of it because, again, it speaks to our knowledge, but it also speaks to our mindset, and again, where does this distaste for business come from? How do people learn that? How has our thoughts come to the point that business is the problem rather than the solution? The reason our economy is as good as it is because of the private sector. So once again, it's about understanding how the economy really works, understanding how money flows, understand how wealth is created, understanding how wealth is destroyed.
Right.
So that's really what it begins with. It just begins with knowledge and understanding from an objective point of view. Don't get me wrong, there's some seriously bad private sector operators out of there. That's why we do need some government, again, especially in a regulatory and enforcement role. But having them step in and become active in an operational role, it's not a solution for anything. We really need to, again, like I say, teach people how to succeed, teach people how to believe in themselves, and teach people to understand what makes the economy work and how can we grow it together.
Basically, you're saying that giving people ability to self-motivate is a bigger key to the equation.
Self-motivation, self-direction, teaching people to be, I've heard the term critical thinkers. I prefer the term analytical thinkers. Teaching people how to problem solve, teaching people how to collect information and process it, teaching people how to tell the difference between reality and baloney. Because again, the world has always been full of misinformation and disinformation propagated by people who have a self-interest to serve. And people need to be able to discern the difference between what's important and what's relevant, learning how to ask questions. Right? That's the key. You know why I love 4-year-olds? Because they love the question why. Everything devolves from that. Why?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being willing to sit down and have this conversation. I think you've provided significant insights that we're all going to have to digest because it's so much information out there, and I think cutting through all of the excessive conversation and getting down to brass tacks to me has always been the solution to everything. So thank you for this, and all the best to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you every success with your new venture. I think what you're doing is filling a very important role. Again, it's part of that education function.
Right.
Asking questions.
Right.
So-
And my biggest thing, why? Why do we have this? Why is this person doing that? Why really is the most fundamental question.
There
Thank
are no
you,
bad
Dale.
questions, just bad answers.